Today's video is going to be a little bit different than usual. Luke and I have been dealing with some very frustrating problems with YouTube over the past couple of weeks. Essentially, everything we are uploading is being completely demonetized. And the truth is, we still aren't really sure what's going on. We're trying to figure it out, but that's taking time. And because of that, things are pretty hectic in terms of our usual writing and research. There's a lot more to say, but I'll leave that for the end of the video, so you don't have to listen to me rant if you're not interested. Anyway, point is, we didn't want to punish you by starting to miss uploads, so we decided to put something together that we hope you'll enjoy. Today, we're going to be covering 3 true crime stories centered around a single theme. Just a heads up, while these are from older videos, all of them have been completely re-edited, and most of them we haven't done on camera before. As for today's theme, each of these cases features some sort of wildly unlikely event or disturbing coincidence. As always, my name is Nigel, I run this channel with my good friend Luke, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. With that out of the way, let's dive in. In February of 2010, detectives with Georgia's Gwinnett County Police Department sat down for an interrogation with the prime suspect in a disturbing local murder case. This man had been arrested following more than a year-long investigation, and it now seemed like all of the pieces of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. Walking into the interview room that day, police were confident. They had built a strong case with both physical and circumstantial evidence. All they were hoping for now was a confession to neatly tie everything together. However, when they confronted the suspect with their mountain of evidence that included DNA that placed him at the scene of the crime, the man would tell them something completely unexpected. And once he revealed this information, detectives would have no choice but to release him and let him walk out the door a completely free man. Just before 9 o'clock on the evening of July 18th, 2008, authorities with Georgia's Gwinnett County Police Department received a frantic 911 call. That call was made by a terrified resident in the city of Duluth, who said that they had just stumbled across a shooting victim in the parking lot of a local strip mall.
911.
The lady just got shot.
Is she breathing?
Yeah, she moving a little.
I've got everybody on the way.
When emergency responders arrived at the scene minutes later, they found the female victim on the ground. She was lying on her back and had suffered a single gunshot wound to her chest. The woman was immediately rushed to the hospital in critical condition. In the meantime, police began to search the scene for clues, although they quickly realized there wasn't much to find. In fact, if it weren't for the victim's blood-stained clothing, other blood scattered on the pavement, and some blue nitrile gloves left behind by paramedics, they might never have known it was a crime scene at all. Thankfully, police were luckier when it came to finding eyewitnesses. The most promising was a bus driver for the Gwinnett County Transit System, who appeared to have seen most of what had happened as it unfolded. The driver told officers that she first noticed the victim shortly before the shooting. At the time, she was sitting in a gold 4-door sedan, which looked like it belonged to her, and she was parked just a couple of spaces away from where she was found by emergency responders. The driver, meanwhile, was inside her bus and had a good vantage point because she was at the small transit station just one parking lot over. A few minutes later, the driver said she saw a man appear out of the darkness and head directly for the victim's gold car. He went to the driver's side door and leaned in for a brief moment. That's when things took a terrifying turn. Within a matter of seconds, the man pulled out a gun and started yelling profanities at the woman. There was a gunshot. The victim was dragged from the vehicle, and the man quickly got inside and drove off. The woman took 2 final steps before falling to the ground. Despite her clear view of the attack, the driver was still about 100 feet away, so she was only able to give a basic description of the suspect. She said that he was a black male who was wearing a white t-shirt with green sleeves. Police had barely had time to consider this information when they received a heartbreaking call from the hospital. Sadly, their female victim had died 10 minutes into surgery. Though she had fought hard due to the extent of her injuries, it was doubtful that she could have been saved even if emergency responders had gotten there instantly. The bullet that hit her had gone through one of her lungs, her diaphragm, and had also punctured her stomach. Now faced with a murder investigation, detectives were even more determined to find the person responsible. But in order to move the case forward, first, they would have to identify the victim. About 6 hours after responding to the scene of the shooting, Gwinnett County detectives were notified about a missing persons report that had been filed back at police headquarters. That report had been made by a 38-year-old woman named Camelia Coleman, who said that she and the rest of her family were desperately worried about her sister, Janai. Camelia explained that Janai lived in Snellville, and that no one had seen her since the previous evening. When she had last spoken to her sister, she was supposed to be going to pick up her 19-year-old daughter from work. But she had never shown up, and no one had been able to reach her since. When investigators learned where Janai had been headed before she disappeared, their hearts sank. Camelia explained that her niece worked at the Red Lobster right by the Gwinnett Place Mall. Sometimes Janai liked to park over by the bus stop at the nearby strip mall to use the free Wi-Fi while she waited for her to finish her shift. Camelia was describing the exact spot where the shooting had taken place. Any remaining doubts that Janai Coleman was the victim were put to rest when Camelia provided further details about her sister's appearance and her vehicle. She drove an older model gold Dodge Intrepid. It was a perfect match to the car the bus driver had described in her witness account. When detectives informed Camelia that her sister had been killed, she was in complete shock. Sure, she had been worried about Janai, but never for a second had she imagined that something like this could have happened to her. Camelia was then left with the heartbreaking task of informing the rest of her family. Many, like their mother, Dr. Geraldine Brown, were left feeling especially helpless because they were more than 700 miles away in the family's hometown of Elkhart, Indiana. Still, they vowed to do whatever they could to help investigators. At this point, authorities were still in the early stages of their investigation, but there were two real theories that they were exploring. The first was that this was some kind of carjacking gone wrong, and the second was that the shooting might be more personal in nature. Janai's family members said that they couldn't think of a single person who would want to hurt her. The 40-year-old had no enemies and had dedicated most of her adult life to making a difference in the lives of others, particularly children. As a young adult, Janai had served in the military. After retiring, she moved to the Atlanta area, where she became a teacher at an elementary school in DeKalb County. She was active in her church and had adopted and raised 3 daughters on her own, all of whom were now adults. Everyone that knew Janai was struck by her incredible passion for education. She was determined to make sure that the young people in her care not only understood what they were being taught, but could take that information and apply it outside of the classroom. Not content with the impact that she was already making, Janai's biggest goal had been to open a preschool of her own. Tragically, she had been close to achieving her dream at the time of her murder. In the months leading up to the crime, she had gotten the necessary certification she needed to start the school and was preparing to move forward with the next stages of her plan. Based on this information, detectives concluded that it was unlikely the shooting was targeted. No one close to Janai appeared to be involved in the crime, and there were no romantic relationships, disgruntled exes, or anyone like that who might have had a motive either. This left a carjacking gone wrong as the most likely scenario. While this was certainly progress, it also meant that the crime was likely random. This would make it incredibly difficult to solve, especially if detectives didn't get their hands on some real evidence pretty soon. Well, as luck would have it, they were about to find one of the best clues they could have hoped for. On July 21st, so 3 days after the murder, detectives with the Gwinnett County Police Department received a critical lead. They were notified that there had been a delayed hit on Janai Coleman's missing vehicle. The vehicle had been flagged by an off-duty police officer about 40 miles away from the crime scene in the Atlanta suburb of Forest Park. When investigators spoke with the officer, he told them that he had flagged the gold Dodge Intrepid following a strange encounter with its driver. This encounter had happened just a couple of hours after the shooting. The officer explained that he had been out late when he spotted a man parking the vehicle in a dark shopping plaza. The man got out and appeared to be heading towards one of the stores, even though all of the businesses there had long since closed for the night. The officer went up to the man, who was talking on a cell phone, and told him that nothing was open in the plaza. The man then immediately got back into the car and drove off. though the off-duty officer had been concerned enough to look up the license plate information of the vehicle. At the time, the search didn't return anything suspicious. This was because detectives still didn't have this information themselves and hadn't yet connected the gold car to Janai's murder. Detectives went to the spot where the officer had seen the vehicle, but unsurprisingly, it wasn't there. However, after spreading out to search the surrounding area, they managed to locate it in the parking lot of a different shopping plaza less than 2 miles away. By this point, the car had clearly been abandoned. It was left double parked and there was no one around it. It was hauled off to the local crime lab so that it could be processed for potential evidence. While waiting for these results, investigators turned their attention to finding additional clues, in particular video surveillance. With the discovery of Janai's car, they now had 2 locations where they knew the killer had been, and they were hoping that there was at least one camera between these 2 areas that had captured footage of the suspect. Once again, police were in luck. They managed to obtain video from both places. The first bits of footage detectives found came from a Quick Trip convenience store. It was located directly across the street from the strip mall where Janai had been parked at the time of her murder. As investigators combed through the video, they spotted a man whose appearance matched the details provided by the bus driver. In addition to the distinctive white shirt with green sleeves, he was wearing a baseball cap and carrying a black bag. He was also talking on a cell phone, something detectives made note of because it lined up with the description provided by the off-duty police officer. The man went inside the convenience store multiple times over the course of the evening of July 18th. During 2 separate visits, he purchased a single beer, becoming mildly agitated with the clerk when he insisted on putting the alcohol in a brown paper bag. After drinking both beers, the man returned one final time. When he did, he bought a pack of cigarettes, Bronson Light Longs. The surveillance camera's audio was actually able to pick this interaction up.
Bronson Light Longs. Longs? Yeah.
The second bit of surveillance video police were able to obtain was from a camera close to where Janai's car had been found abandoned. The video had been recorded at 11:56 p.m. on the night of the murder and showed what was unmistakably the same man walking through a nearby parking lot. He had on the same white shirt with green sleeves and was carrying the same black bag. Confident that they now had footage of their suspect, authorities released images from these surveillance tapes to the public in the hopes that someone out there would be able to identify the killer. Around this same time, they received more good news. The forensic analysis on Janai Coleman's car was complete, and it had produced 2 even more promising pieces of evidence. The first thing forensic technicians found were fingerprints. It was believed that they belonged to the unknown male suspect because they were found on top of and just below the driver's side window. These were exactly the 2 places someone would have likely touched if they were leaning in through the window, just as the bus driver had described. The second thing technicians found was far and away the best piece of evidence they had uncovered yet. In the back of the car, tucked just below the driver's seat, was a cigarette butt. Not just any cigarette butt, though. A Bronson Light Long. Even without the footage from the convenience store, this would have been interesting. Janai didn't smoke and never allowed anyone else to smoke in her vehicle either. But combined, the evidence was incredibly compelling. It looked as though the suspect had been smoking while driving and had attempted to carelessly flick the cigarette out the window. Detectives concluded it must have caught the wind just right and ended up flying back to where it was ultimately found. On top of all of this, the crime lab had been able to extract an unknown male DNA profile from the cigarette butt. They now had the DNA of their killer. However, this is where detectives' incredible run of luck would seemingly run out. When they submitted the DNA to CODIS, they received no hits. The fingerprints returned no match to any known perpetrators either. Even the release of the surveillance video was a bust. The images were run on the news and distributed to the public, but resulted in no credible tips. Understandably, this was deeply frustrating, both for investigators and for the loved ones of Janai Coleman, who were desperately awaiting answers. Police were so close, yet at the same time, there was no telling if they would ever get the break that they needed to finally solve the case. Well, as it happened, authorities would get lucky one more time. However, it would also lead to one of the most unexpected twists they had ever encountered. In early 2010, detectives working the Janai Coleman case received the best news they had gotten in well over a year. A new entry had been made in the CODIS system, and the DNA sample matched the one they had taken from the cigarette butt found in the back of Janai's car. The profile belonged to a 51-year-old man named Donald Smith. Neither police nor Janai's family had heard of Donald Smith, but that wasn't exactly unexpected. By this point, they were fairly confident in their theory that the case had been a random carjacking. What was more important was Donald's criminal history. He was a convicted felon and had been involved in similar crimes such as bank robbery and armed robbery. He also bore a striking resemblance to the man in the surveillance videos investigators had obtained. When police looked up cell phone numbers associated with Donald Smith, they were even more convinced that they were on the right track. They found one that appeared to belong to him, and when this was cross-referenced with data from cell towers, it showed a device with this number had been in both of the areas associated with the shooting on the night of July 18, 2008. Now feeling that their case was overwhelming, authorities tracked Donald Smith down. On February 3rd, he was arrested and brought in for questioning. As soon as detectives revealed why Donald had been taken into custody, he immediately denied any involvement in the crime. He said that he'd never seen Janai Coleman before, never seen her vehicle, and definitely didn't kill anybody.
Have you ever met this woman before in your life?
No, I haven't. I have never seen this woman before.
Oh.
Ever.
Have you ever seen this vehicle before or been in it?
No, I have not.
Of course, detectives were expecting this response. After all, very few people come right out and admit to murder. What was unusual, though, was when Donald refused to change his story even after police started confronting him with the mountain of evidence they had collected. Evidence which, let's remember, included a DNA match that placed him in Janai's car.
That is definitely not me. I don't have a shirt like that. I can't even see the face on that person. That's not me.
Okay, so that's not you.
No, definitely not me.
At this point, detectives were fairly taken aback. Like, here was this overwhelming case that they had put together, and this guy was just gonna sit here and brazenly lie to them? Figuring they might at least be able to catch him in a lie, investigators asked Donald to take a polygraph test. He agreed, and predictably failed miserably. Here's the thing, though. While Donald failed the polygraph test, at least as far as detectives could tell, he wasn't lying about everything. His answers about recognizing the person in the surveillance footage showed signs of deception, but when it came to questions about Janai and the details of the murder, it looked like he might actually be telling the truth. When police observed Donald during a smoke break, they also noticed something else interesting. The cigarettes he was smoking were not Bronson Light Longs. They were hand-rolled. Sure, this was a minor detail, but it was the first real piece of information so far that didn't line up with the rest of the investigation. When Donald returned to the interview room, detectives tried one final time to get him to admit to what had happened. By this point, he knew he had failed the polygraph, and it was clear he was feeling the pressure. It turned out that Donald was ready to talk, but he wasn't about to give a confession. Donald explained that he had lied before. He did know the person on the surveillance videos police had showed him. It was his identical twin brother, Ronald Smith.
That is my twin. That is my twin. All I'm saying is that wasn't me in the video, that's him in the video.
As you might imagine, detectives initially didn't quite know what to make of this. I mean, let's be honest, it sounds super fake. My evil twin did it. I mean, how convenient is that? The thing is, though, Donald did have an identical twin brother named Ronald Smith, and Ronald also lived in the metro Atlanta area. As unbelievable as all of this sounded, investigators quickly realized it was a potential disaster for their case. You see, identical twins have the same DNA, or at least they usually share such a substantial amount of their DNA that telling them apart through forensic tests like those conducted on the cigarette butt would be almost impossible. In other words, all the cigarette proved was that it could have been either Donald or Ronald inside of Janai Coleman's car. So, what were police supposed to do? Okay, so it's at this point where I have to make a tiny confession. Technically, I lied before when I said the detectives only got lucky one last time. There was one more thing that really went their way, and this one literally could have made or destroyed their case. What am I talking about? Well, while identical twins do have the same DNA, what they don't have are the same fingerprints. No two people on the planet have the same fingerprints. Those are 100% unique. If you recall, forensic techs had recovered fingerprints from Janai Coleman's vehicle, and those fingerprints belonged to Ronald Smith, not Donald Smith. Donald had been telling the truth all along. He did not kill Janai Coleman. If there were any remaining doubts about Ronald Smith's guilt, those were put to bed when police tracked him down. At the time, he was carrying the cell phone that authorities originally thought belonged to Donald, and he was smoking a Bronson Light Long cigarette. When Ronald was brought in for questioning, he confessed to the crime. He said that he was just trying to steal Janai's car, but that when he approached her, she tried to stall and things went south. He claimed that the gun he used had a hair trigger and that it had simply gone off.
And yeah, an accident. I can't even say that enough. It went off.
Despite his confession, after being charged with Janai Coleman's murder, Ronald Smith pleaded not guilty. When the case went to trial, he tried to muddy the waters further by blaming his brother for the crime, claiming that his prints were only on the stolen car because he had helped to clean it up after the shooting. In the end, the jury didn't buy his story, though, and he was convicted of malice murder, hijacking of a vehicle, and possession of a firearm. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 25 years and currently remains incarcerated at the Wheeler Correctional Facility in Alamo, Georgia. At 55 years old, Greg Flanagan was what you might call a creature of habit. Though in his younger years, he would spend months at sea on ocean-going vessels where he worked as a chief engineer, he had since given up this life, becoming what's known in Texas as a landman. Greg had partnered with his older brother Michael to form the OGM Land Company, and he was responsible for negotiating directly with landowners to acquire leases for the exploration and development of new areas for oil and gas companies. Every Monday morning, Greg would make the roughly 2-hour drive from the home he shared with his wife Susie in Lafayette, Louisiana, to Beaumont, Texas, where his company was headquartered. He would check into a room at the MCM Elegante Hotel that was paid for by the company, spending the next 4 days working in the local area before heading back home on Thursday night. Equally as consistent as Greg's work routines were his travel habits. He liked to pack light and keep things tidy, carrying with him a single rolling suitcase, which he used more or less as a drawer once inside his hotel room. The exceptions were any shirts that needed to stay unwrinkled, which were hung up in the closet, as well as Greg's toiletries, which were all neatly packed in their own folding case that could be hooked onto the bathroom towel rack. At the end of each workday, he would place his well-worn leather boots next to his suitcase and change out of his jeans and into cotton pajama bottoms. After that, he liked to relax on the bed and watch whatever was on TV, making sure to crank up the air conditioning before he did so that he could get a comfortable night's sleep. It was at this time that he indulged in what could arguably be called his only two vices: cigarettes and sweets. Greg had been a smoker since his teens, and he liked to enjoy a can of soda and a chocolate bar while he whittled away the hours before he fell asleep. So it was that on the night of September 15th, 2010, Greg Flanagan found himself relaxing on his bed in room 348 of the MCM Elegante Hotel. It was a Wednesday night, meaning that he was already well into the week's routine and was comfortable in the third-floor room in the hotel's cabana wing, a section of the building that was built to overlook a small pool area just outside. After changing into his pajamas, Greg grabbed his cigarettes, phone, lighter, and an ashtray and laid them neatly out on the bed next to him on a clean hand towel. He also took out a Crispy Crunch chocolate bar and a can of root beer, cracking into both as he surfed through the channels of his TV before deciding on the movie Iron Man 2. While watching his movie, Greg responded to an email from his wife Susie. She had messaged to let him know that she was using a computer program to file for a tax extension. Greg encouragingly replied, "You're doing good, babe." It was the last time Susie would ever hear from him again. The following morning, Susie started to become concerned when Greg failed to call her. They spoke every day on the phone before work, and it wasn't the kind of thing Greg would simply forget. On top of that, he hadn't answered his phone despite repeated calls. When Susie called Greg's office in Beaumont, her concern only deepened when she discovered that her husband had not made it in. Two of his coworkers agreed that they would drive over to the Elegante Hotel and check on him. When the coworkers arrived at room 348, they knocked, but there was no answer at the door. After retrieving the hotel manager, the door was finally opened, revealing a startling scene. Greg was collapsed onto the rug face first, a cigarette still clutched between two fingers in his left hand. The room was exceptionally warm, and it was clear that Greg was dead. His skin had turned grayish blue. A little more than an hour later, Beaumont Police Detective Scott Apple arrived at the scene and began to investigate. Aside from Greg's lifeless body near the room's doorway, not much stood out to him. There were no signs of a break-in, and the room's door remained locked, only accessible to someone with a key. Nothing appeared to be out of place, and things were found in the characteristically neat way that Greg always left them. A quick check of Greg's wallet seemed to rule out robbery definitively. There was an untouched stack of $100 bills inside that easily could have been taken if someone had somehow managed to break in. Guests in adjoining rooms told investigators that they hadn't heard anything out of the ordinary either. In fact, there didn't seem to be evidence that anyone other than Greg had been inside of his room the previous night. There were no obvious signs of injuries to his body, other than a small mark on his left cheek, but this appeared to have come from when he fell face first onto the floor. Detective Apple searched Greg's belongings for pills or any other drugs that might explain his sudden death, but this also turned up nothing. It wasn't until Apple spoke to Greg's wife Susie and his brother Michael that he first started to feel like he might have made sense of things. The family members told him that though Greg appeared to be slim and relatively healthy, there were reasons to believe that he might have died from natural causes. In addition to his chain smoking and lack of any attention to his diet, Greg also never exercised and never went to the doctor. A sudden heart attack seemed like a real possibility. According to Susie, this idea was even mildly comforting at first. Greg would have wanted to die on his own terms, with the knowledge of never having changed his lifestyle or anything like that. It seemed like the case would be quickly wrapped up, until Greg's body was sent for an autopsy to Jefferson County Medical Examiner Dr. Tommy Brown. Like Detective Apple, Brown's external inspection of Greg's body seemed to yield few clues. He noticed the same 1-inch abrasion on Greg's cheek, and the only other visible injury seemed to be to his crotch area, a small laceration to his scrotum. This would have been easily missed by detectives because Greg was wearing his pajama pants when he was found, but still, it didn't seem to be any cause for alarm. However, it was when Dr. Brown opened Greg up and began to inspect his internal organs that the case radically changed. There was a serious amount of blood and damage to his intestines, so much so that some partially digested food had spilled out. There were also cuts to his stomach and liver, and he had 2 broken ribs and a hole in the right atrium of his heart. Based on the signs of severe trauma to the inside of his body, Dr. Brown concluded that Greg had likely been beaten or crushed by a heavy object. He said that the wounds to his groin area could have been from a kick, but it was likely a blow to his chest that had killed him. Brown said that Greg would have died from his injuries in a matter of seconds, and wrote in his report that the manner of death was homicide. As you can imagine, this came as quite a shock to Detective Apple, who had so far found no evidence to suggest that Greg had been murdered. But Brown was persistent, saying that his internal injuries were significant, resembling those of a car crash victim or someone who had been trapped under a heavy fallen object. With this new information in hand, Apple began to work the case as a homicide investigation. However, each new piece of evidence that he uncovered only seemed to make Greg's death even more baffling. For starters, there didn't seem to be any motive behind the crime. The more time Apple spent interviewing the obvious suspects, such as his wife Susie and his business partner brother Michael, the less he became convinced that they were involved. By all accounts, Susie and Greg had a wonderful and loving relationship. They'd even married each other twice. They had been together in their younger years and separated, only to reconnect and remarry 15 years later after realizing they were both still in love. It was the same story at Greg's company. His brother Michael and all of his co-workers loved him. If anything, Greg was kind and easygoing to a fault. Further exploration of Greg's personal life revealed that he wasn't a drinker, and he wasn't the kind of person to try and pick up women. In fact, in the close to a decade that Greg had been making his weekly trips to the Elegante, no one could even remember him making so much as a visit to the hotel bar. Though he knew many of the staff members by name and got along with them well, he wasn't usually the type to socialize while in Beaumont. His work was tiring, and after a long day, Greg's greatest desire was usually to hole up in his room alone watching movies before bed. Surveillance footage taken from the hotel proved this. On the night of September 15th, Greg had gone straight to room 348 after returning from work. He had not left the room between then and the time his body was discovered. Thanks to some careful digging, though, Detective Apple was able to learn that something unusual had taken place on the night of Greg's death. Maintenance records showed that at some point in the early evening, Greg had blown a fuse while cooking prepackaged popcorn in the microwave of his room. The outage had affected a couple of adjacent rooms, as well as a few more underneath. Greg had called the front desk to report the incident, and a maintenance worker had come up and sorted things out. The man had left Greg's room at 8:30 that night after resetting the breaker. From this, Apple came up with two theories. The first had to do with the maintenance man, who Apple discovered had a previous criminal record. The detective speculated that perhaps the maintenance man had attacked Greg while he was in the room, possibly in some spur-of-the-moment crime. However, there was no actual evidence tying the maintenance man to anything, and the theory never came together. The second theory concerned a group of union electricians who were staying at the Elegante for an extended period of time while working a job for an oil company. At least two of the men, Lance Mueller and Tim Steinmetz, had been staying directly next door to Greg in room 349, and their room had been a hangout spot for several of the other electricians who were also staying at the hotel. Apple speculated that perhaps while drinking in their room, some of the electricians had become angry about the blown fuse, and had somehow worked out that it was Greg who had caused it. Perhaps one or more of them had confronted Greg, beating him before Greg managed to get back inside and collapse on the floor. However, none of the electricians seemed like they had anything to hide when Apple spoke to them. In fact, they seemed just as confused and upset about Greg's death as anyone, and appeared to be genuinely sorry that they hadn't heard anything noteworthy on the night of his death. They also willingly provided their information to Apple and the other detectives in case they could be of any further assistance. In addition to these details, nothing unusual had been recorded in the hall outside of the rooms on the hotel's surveillance cameras that night. And based on Dr. Brown's autopsy report, it seemed unlikely that Greg would have even been able to make it back into his room if his injuries had been sustained while he was out in the hall. On top of all of this, Apple was still left with the perplexing problem of how Greg's injuries had actually occurred. There didn't seem to be anything in his room that would have been heavy enough to create such substantial internal injuries, and it was hard to believe that Greg had been beaten to death given the almost complete lack of bruising to his body. It seemed that Apple had hit a dead end. A $50,000 reward was offered by Greg's family for information leading to the arrest of his killer, but this too failed to uncover any answers. Several months later, in February of 2011, Susie reached out to a man named Ken Brennan out of desperation. Brennan was a former Long Island cop and DEA special agent who now worked as a private detective based out of Florida. To Susie's surprise, Brennan picked up her phone call almost immediately, and upon learning some of the details about her husband's case, was immediately intrigued. After first meeting with her at her home in Lafayette and asking her questions to the point that he was satisfied she wasn't involved in the murder, Brennan asked Susie if there was anything she had learned about her husband's crime scene that didn't seem right to her. She replied that she was surprised that Greg's co-workers had found his room so warm when they discovered his body. Greg always liked to turn up the air conditioning fairly high. After finishing up his interview with Susie, Brennan agreed to head out to Beaumont and meet with Detective Apple. The two men got along well, and Apple agreed to let Brennan assist on the case. By that point, he was happy to have a fresh set of eyes. To Apple's complete disbelief, after visiting room 348 once and then poring over crime scene photos and autopsy results, Brennan announced that he thought he had solved the case. Though Apple was skeptical, Brennan asked him to hear him out and said that the first thing he needed to do was call Susie. When Brennan got on the phone with Susie, he had two questions for her. Was Greg left-handed or right-handed? She replied that he was right-handed. Brennan then asked if he always smoked with his right hand, to which Susie replied that she was positive that he always did. After hanging up the phone, Brennan started to explain his thought process to Apple. They knew that Greg liked to keep his room nice and cold, so the only way the room would have been warm when his body was discovered is if the AC had been turned off by someone or something else. And they had proof of that. Greg had blown the fuse in the room earlier that night, which would have shut the AC off along with everything else. Brennan speculated that when the power was restored to Greg's room, the AC must not have automatically reset, but that it would have taken a little bit of time for him to notice this. Because Greg never turned the air conditioner back on, and it was extremely hot in Beaumont that September, that likely meant that Greg had died just a short time after the maintenance worker had left his room, probably between 8:30 and 9 p.m. Furthermore, Brennan concluded that the cigarette in Greg's left hand meant that whatever happened to him must have happened suddenly and while he was in his room. He speculated that whatever had injured Greg had caused him to get up from his bed and run towards the door. He had likely transferred the cigarette from his right hand to his left hand in order to open the door, but had collapsed before he made it. Brennan concluded that this also meant that whatever happened to Greg, he had not seen it coming. In light of this new information, Brennan now turned his attention to the electricians that had been staying in neighboring rooms, just as Detective Apple had done before. But this time, they expanded the group of people they talked to, reaching out to people who might have second or even third-hand knowledge of something happening at the Elegante Hotel. Though most of the men that were interviewed repeated the same basic information that was common knowledge about Greg Flanagan's death, one man named Aaron Burke remembered hearing something different. He didn't have many specifics, but he remembered hearing something about a gun going off in a boarding house. Immediately after the interview, Brennan told Apple they needed to head back to the Elegante Hotel. Once they arrived, they began to scour the entire room looking for anything unusual. Finally, Brennan found it. An indentation in the wall alongside the closed door in room 348 that led to 349. The indentation was barely noticeable, and it was clearly left over from a repair job that had been done. During the investigation, the mark that had originally been there had likely been overlooked because it appeared to line up with the handle of the door. It would have looked like normal hotel room wear and tear from the handle repeatedly hitting the wall when opened too roughly. However, when Brennan opened the door, the indentation in the wall and the door handle didn't quite line up. When Brennan and Apple went to the other side of the door in room 349 and went to the spot that corresponded with the indentation in room 348, they found that there was a small hole that had been covered up with a pink filler. It turned out to be dried toothpaste. When crime scene investigators carefully excavated the holes on either side of the wall and shined a laser through, the trajectory lined up exactly with where Greg would have been sitting on his bed on the night of his death. Brennan and Apple were now positive that Greg Flanagan had been shot. Though Dr. Brown took some convincing, he eventually agreed with Brennan and Apple that a bullet had caused Greg's fatal internal injuries. Though Greg's body had been cremated and could no longer be usefully exhumed, re-examination of the autopsy photos confirmed Brennan's theory. The bullet had entered Greg's body through his groin area, had traveled up through his internal organs, and finally had pierced his heart. Dr. Brown had likely missed the bullet's entry wound because bruising had obscured the area and skin from the lacerations had covered the bullet hole. The final pieces of the puzzle came together when Apple and Brennan re-interviewed Tim Steinmetz, one of the two men that had been staying in room 349 on the night of Greg's death. When they met with Steinmetz, the detectives told him that it was just a routine procedure and that they wanted to make sure they had every detail they needed from him. When he told detectives the same story as he had after Greg's death, they didn't push back at all and continued to act casually. Once Steinmetz signed his written statement saying that he knew nothing about Greg's death, Apple and Brennan immediately rounded on him, telling him that they knew that he was lying and had just made a false police report. Finally, Steinmetz told investigators the truth. On the night of September 15th, he, his roommate Lance Mueller, and a third man named Trent Pisano had been drinking beer in room 349. At some point, Mueller had asked Pisano to head down to his car to grab a bottle of whiskey. He also told him to bring up his 9mm pistol. When Pisano came back, Mueller began to fool around with the gun in a drunken state. First, he pointed it at Steinmetz, who quickly dropped to the floor and started yelling at him to stop. Mueller then pointed the gun in Pisano's direction in a similar fashion, only this time the gun accidentally went off. On the same day that Steinmetz gave his confession, Pisano corroborated his story, saying that when the gun first discharged, he thought he had been hit. The three then noticed in horror that there was a hole in the wall behind them. According to Pisano and Steinmetz, Mueller immediately freaked out after realizing what had happened and hurriedly took the weapon back out to his car. By the time he returned, Pisano was gone. None of them were initially sure if there was anyone next door, but eventually recalled that they had heard the sounds of coughing coming from room 348 the previous night. However, instead of going to check on the occupant of the room or alerting authorities, Steinmetz and Mueller simply went down to the hotel bar and continued to drink. Mueller later patched the hole in the wall with the toothpaste. It wasn't until the next morning, Steinmetz claimed, when they saw a body being wheeled out of room 348 on a gurney, that they realized something was seriously wrong. But because detectives initially believed that Greg died of natural causes, they apparently tried to convince themselves that his death was a coincidence. On October 29, 2012, Lance Mueller was sentenced to 10 years in prison after pleading no contest to manslaughter. Detectives went after him because he was the one that had actually fired the gun. Though Mueller apologized for his actions at his sentencing, the judge berated him for his series of incredibly irresponsible choices, saying that this wasn't just a simple accident. These thoughts were echoed even more ferociously by Greg's wife, Susie, who said, quote, "You would never have come forward with the truth. You murdered him. No, you didn't intentionally seek him out to murder him, but you murdered him. With every lie you told, with every intentional selfish deception, with every cover-up over and over again. You saw his body taken out of the room in a body bag the next day. You knew you killed him. He meant nothing to you." At around midnight on June 22, 1991, 41-year-old Charles Holden was in the home stretch of his usual work night routine. He had just finished working the second shift at his factory job at the DuPont company and was now heading home to his trailer, located a few miles east of the small city of Harrington, Delaware. Like most nights, Charles decided to stop at the Hardee's Drive-In for some fast food on the way home. The restaurant was conveniently located at the intersection of US Highway 13 and Delaware Highway 14, and from there, it was only a short drive to his trailer. Upon arriving at the Hardee's, Charles placed his usual order of a coffee and a hamburger and waited in his truck. He had just received his food and was getting ready to leave when he was approached by a stranger. The man was in his late 20s or early 30s, was slim, and appeared to be about 5 feet 8 inches tall. He was also wearing glasses with large dark frames. His appearance at the side of Charles's truck was not a total surprise, as Charles had already seen the man go up to a couple of other people at the restaurant, asking them some questions before moving on. It was obvious that he was a hitchhiker. When the stranger got to Charles's truck, he immediately asked him for a favor. Would it be possible for Charles to give him a ride to Milford Memorial Hospital in the next town over? He said that his sister had just had a baby and he had no way of getting there. At first, Charles told the man that he was sorry, but no, he couldn't do it. Sure, Milford wasn't that far away, but it was already late and he was headed home, and the trip would take him well past where he needed to be. But possibly sensing the man's desperation and wanting to be a good Samaritan, Charles decided to give the stranger a different option. He said that he could ride with him a short distance in the direction of Milford, but that he would drop him off once he was no longer headed that way. The man agreed and hopped into Charles's truck, and they began to head east down Delaware Highway 14. About 3 miles down the highway, Charles came to a stop outside of a local mechanics business called Blake's Garage. He was now at the intersection of Killen Pond Road, where he needed to make his turnoff to head the rest of the way to his trailer, though Charles did not want to share this information with the man. Instead, Charles directed the man to a nearby payphone, suggesting that maybe here he could arrange for a ride the rest of the way. After all, he was now a good chunk of the distance to the hospital. Though the stranger had acted relatively normal up until this point, upon hearing that Charles could take him no further, he immediately snapped. First, he got angry and started to argue with him, and when that didn't work, he pulled out a screwdriver and attacked. Fearing for his life, Charles jumped out of the truck with his keys and tried to make a run for help, but the stranger was too fast for him and quickly caught up. When he did, Charles managed to calm him down by saying that he would drive him wherever he wanted to go. The men walked back to the truck, but before the stranger could get in on the passenger side, Charles accelerated away as fast as he could, leaving the enraged man in the middle of the street still outside of the garage. Though Charles was relieved to have survived the harrowing ordeal, he quickly realized that he couldn't now simply make the turnoff for his home. Though his trailer was located roughly half a mile down the road and was situated on a more than 160-acre plot of land on his family's farm, he didn't want to risk being followed. Charles decided that instead of immediately heading home, he would drive around for a while and maybe try to take a different route there. He also just kind of needed a little bit of time to shake off what had happened. He was bruised on the face from the fight with the stranger, and part of his arm had been burned when he spilled his coffee in surprise at being attacked. After feeling like he had calmed down a little while later, Charles finally made his way to the trailer. However, the calm wouldn't last very long. Chillingly, when he pulled up, he saw a shadowy figure on his lawn peering into his windows. Thoroughly freaked out by this point, Charles immediately fled in his truck, driving back into Harrington to use a payphone to call 911. This happened at 1:19 a.m. The prowler call was weirdly, apparently a low priority for local authorities, but eventually police showed up and helped Charles to check his trailer. Nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary, and for a moment it seemed like the nightmare might be over. But there was one more place Charles wanted to check before he sent the police on their way. He wondered if they could check in on his 70-year-old mother, Dorothy Donovan, who lived in a 2-story farmhouse next door. Disturbingly, when Charles and the police got to Dorothy's home, they noticed that the back door showed signs of a break-in. The glass in one of the door's windows had been broken, seemingly allowing someone to reach in and open it from the inside. When they entered the house, their calls to Dorothy also went unanswered. They soon discovered why. The elderly woman had been stabbed more than a dozen times and was now lying dead in her bed. At first, police turned their attention to Charles. After all, his only explanation for the night's events had to do with a mysterious violent hitchhiker who, by Charles's own admission, had been more than half a mile from his mother's house when he had made his escape. Charles couldn't even say for sure that this was the person that he had seen prowling around his house when he drove back earlier that morning, as he had fled in terror before he could get a good look. There was also the fact that nothing appeared to have been stolen from Dorothy's house, and the home had not been ransacked. If robbery wasn't the motive, police theorized that the crime was likely personal in nature. Further investigation revealed that Dorothy had likely been dead for an hour or two before they had discovered her body, between the time Charles claimed to have had the encounter with the hitchhiker and when he had placed his call to police. While it seemed possible to investigators that Charles could have committed the crime during this time and then taken steps to cover it up, it seemed less likely that an unknown attacker could have somehow found his mother's house and carried out a frenzied attack, especially since there were plenty of other homes in the surrounding area. Even Charles had trouble rationalizing the situation. Though he concluded that the killer must have been the same man who attacked him, he would later tell the media, quote, "I can't figure out how he got there so fast." Unbelievably, though, as authorities began to dig deeper, they soon found compelling evidence that Charles was telling the truth. Witnesses who were at the Hardys around the same time that night also remembered seeing a hitchhiker that matched the description Charles gave to police. A man who passed the garage where Charles was attacked also told investigators that he saw the fight between him and the strange hitchhiker taking place. But the most important piece of exculpatory evidence came in the form of a bloody palm print left on the banister of the stairs leading up to the second floor of Dorothy's house. The print wasn't a match to Charles, nor was other DNA found at the crime scene. Though Charles was now definitively ruled out as a suspect, the information came as little solace to him or the rest of his family. Instead, they were simply left with more questions, as well as the guilt of wondering whether there was more they could have done to prevent Dorothy's death. The 70-year-old had lived alone in her 2-story farmhouse since the death of her second husband in 1987. It was the home where Charles and his 2 sisters had spent a majority of their childhoods. It had always felt safe, like nothing bad could ever happen there. Aside from this, Dorothy had always been outgoing and independent, the kind of person who cared for others instead of needing to be cared for herself. Despite her advanced age, she had retained these qualities. She loved to spend time working in her garden and was a familiar face at her church and the local senior center. She was close with all of her children and 7 grandchildren and had no enemies to speak of. The idea that she could have died in such a horrific way was unthinkable to her friends and family. While a sketch of the mysterious hitchhiker was quickly created and circulated based on the numerous witness accounts given to police, it did not generate the tips that investigators had hoped for. Based on the little they knew about the suspect, they feared that he was an opportunistic criminal who was simply passing through the area at the time. And as weeks began to pass with no new information, this fear seemed to be proven correct. Leads eventually dried up altogether, until finally, the case went cold. In late 1994, the show Unsolved Mysteries announced that they would be doing a segment about Dorothy's case. The segment ultimately aired in May of 1995, and at the time, showrunners told local media in interviews that they were optimistic the case could be solved. As a side note, I remember watching reruns of this episode as a kid, and still remember Dorothy and Charles' story as being one of the most frightening ones I ever heard. Unfortunately, despite the high hopes for the Unsolved Mysteries segment, it too failed to uncover substantial new information about the unknown hitchhiker. At the beginning of 2001, so close to the 10-year anniversary of Dorothy's murder, the media reported that authorities were beginning to actively reinvestigate the case, and that they were also starting to consider alternative theories of the case. This new direction was largely driven by a couple of profilers from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, who looked at the investigation and were convinced that the unknown hitchhiker theory was simply a red herring. Many of the arguments for this were similar to those that police initially considered when their investigation had briefly focused on Charles. In particular, they zeroed in on the lack of stolen items from Dorothy's house and the brutality of her murder. They theorized that in order to not have disturbed any items in her home during the middle of the night, the culprit likely would have had to have possessed prior knowledge about the layout of her home, and they suggested that the nature of her death showed that the crime was personal. In short, though Charles had been ruled out, Dorothy had likely still been killed by someone she knew. Though this theory would eventually be proven incorrect, this new investigation would still prove to be extremely worthwhile, when DNA evidence would finally reveal the answers that police had been searching for all these years. As part of the 2001 investigation, blood samples from the 1991 crime scene were sent to the FBI for analysis. Eventually, these made their way to the State Medical Examiner's Office in Wilmington and were submitted to the National CODIS DNA database. In November of 2005, more than 14 years after Dorothy was murdered, investigators received news that blew the case wide open. A DNA match had been found in the database to a 41-year-old Maryland man named Gilbert E. Cannon. Cannon was a convicted felon with a criminal history dating back to 1981, and whose rap sheet included robbery, theft, escape after conviction, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, burglary, and assault. His most recent conviction for robbery had landed him in prison for 7 years, and he had been required to provide a DNA sample upon his release in September of 2004. This was how the DNA match had been made. Though Cannon's whereabouts were unknown at the time the match was found, as he had fled while on parole, by January of 2006, police were able to track him down and place him under arrest. More DNA tests confirmed Cannon's connection to the crime scene, and his palm print was found to be a match to the one that had been left on Dorothy's banister. Following Cannon's arrest, the full truth about the crime finally came out. As hard as it was for many people to believe, Cannon really was both the same man behind Dorothy's killing and the person that Charles had given a ride to on that June night back in 1991. Cannon eventually confessed to police that he had been high on drugs at the time, and that after he attacked Charles, he began to walk down the road looking for a place to sleep. By pure coincidence, he headed in the direction of Dorothy's house, passing several others along the way. He did not know either her or Charles, and the only reason he chose Dorothy's house to break into was that it was the first house he arrived at where all of the lights appeared to be off. He said that he killed her to stop her from being able to identify him. In April of 2007, Cannon accepted a plea bargain in connection with the case, agreeing to plead guilty to first-degree murder to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Though their mother's killer was now put behind bars, sadly, reports from the time state that the ordeal caused a rift between Charles and his two sisters. Even after almost 16 years, it appeared that they couldn't understand why he had chosen to give Cannon a ride that night. They gave statements to the media at the time saying that they were attempting to mend their relationship, though unfortunately, it's unclear whether the distance between them ever fully healed. Sadly, Charles's youngest sister, Diana, passed away in August of 2020 at the age of just 66 years old. Okay, I'm going to assume if you're still here, that's because you're interested in hearing more about our current struggles with YouTube. And I'll be honest, folks, this one has been frustrating. So what's been happening is that basically all of our recent uploads have been getting demonetized. This means that YouTube has deemed them not advertiser friendly. And as a result, no matter how many people watch our videos, we receive little to no revenue. Now, this is something that has existed for a long time on YouTube. Creators have always had to follow guidelines in order to make sure that what they're putting out is brand safe. But as time has gone on, those guidelines have gotten fuzzier and far more open-ended, to the point that they're so broad that any video can be demonetized for any reason, and there will be some explanation YouTube can point to that technically fits within a category that makes it not safe for ads. Again, this is something we've talked about before, and something we've been dealing with for a long time on YouTube. We also know that we're in kind of a difficult niche. Crime tends to require us to talk about a lot of dark topics. But we also try very hard to be as responsible as possible when it comes to the stories we cover and how we cover them. We do our best to focus on people rather than sensational or morbid details. But recently, it feels like something has changed on YouTube. We're not sure exactly what, because these things are never clearly communicated to creators. But it seems that there has been some kind of new content policy quietly rolled out in the background. And as of right now, we've had more videos demonetized in the last few weeks than in the previous 2 or 3 years. This is quite concerning because we're not really sure what it means for the future of the channel. Luke and I love making these videos and diving into cases with all of you, but we can only devote this kind of time to doing this if there's revenue coming in. I know there's probably some of you out there who are tired of hearing about this. Quite frankly, I'm tired of talking about it. I hate talking about money in general. But unfortunately, it's not just about Luke and I. We also have editors and other people whose livelihoods rely on what we do here. At the same time, it's about more than that. One of the most frustrating parts of this platform is that you can try your best to follow all of the guidelines, only for the rules of the game to be changed on you at any time. I want to make it clear, this is not supposed to be some kind of woe is me sob story. I know how lucky I am to be able to do this, and Luke and I feel so incredibly grateful, especially for the amazing encouragement and support we get from all of you week after week. But I am worried. Not just about the future of Crime Zone, but about the future of this whole online content ecosystem, particularly as more and more of it seems to be trending towards mindless, brand-safe AI slop that's slapped together and churned out at an increasingly alarming rate. Unfortunately, I'm not sure how we can fix any of this on the macro level. I don't have any satisfying answers. But in the meantime, if you value our work, one of the best ways you can continue to help is through direct support, whether over on Patreon or right here on YouTube. You may have noticed that we just launched memberships on YouTube, which allows you to become a channel member for a monthly fee. In exchange, you get a bunch of cool little things like custom badges next to your name in the comments and emojis you can use. You'll also get access to additional stories every week for our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International series. We're also planning to add even more extras as we continue this into the future. Now, we know times are tough for a lot of people financially, so we've set one of these subscription tiers as low as possible here on YouTube. That being said, we're aware many people just do not have the money to spare, and if that's your situation, we totally understand. Luke and I do not want anyone feeling guilted or shamed into joining, and we still very much appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment you send our way. And to those of you who have been financially supporting for a while now on Patreon and continue to do so, just know that you have our unending gratitude. Obviously, this is not the way we were hoping to tell you all about the launch of our memberships, and we will make more of a fun announcement once things have hopefully settled a little bit, but we just wanted to be as transparent as possible about what's going on and share some of our concerns. Anyway, regardless of what happens, thanks so much for watching. We appreciate the heck out of each and every one of you, and we hope to see you next time.